Hello, this is Gina Piscatelli with the last lecture topic for the urinary system. This presentation is intended for A&P2 students at Madison Area Technical College. This topic addresses what the anatomy and histology of the urine collecting organs looks like, as well as their function in the storage and release of urine. This relates to study questions number 17 and number 18 in your study question packet. If you need further information, you can find some excellent YouTube videos on Micturition, which is just a fancy word for urinating, and also your textbook, Chapter 25, Section 9. So the urine collecting organs include the ureters, the urinary bladder, and the urethra. They have the function to transport urine from the kidney, collect the urine, store the urine, and then eventually be able to release it or eliminate it. The ureters are shown in this diagram right here. Right there is a ureter, and I'll draw it coming down on this side. The ureter is seen to come in the posterior portion of the bladder, so it comes from behind, and it actually opens on the inferior surface as well down here. That's where the ureter openings are, down low right there. So that's what you're looking at here, is the bladder with two ureters that have been cut off. And then of course you're familiar with the urethra as well. The urethra is the tube that carries the urine out of the body from the bladder. So the ureters convey urine from the renal pelvis to the urinary bladder, and they do have a muscular wall, so they are able to do a sort of a peristalsis type wave-like contraction. The ureter wall has three layers. The outermost layer is the adventitia, and the adventitia is made up of fibrous connective tissue, so it's kind of like right here. Then in the middle we have smooth muscle, and the smooth muscle is very difficult to distinguish here. Some of the smooth muscle is going around in a circular pattern, and some of the smooth muscle has been cut because there's fibers that are coming kind of out of the screen towards you. So those are longitudinal fibers that are here and here. Then the innermost layer is called the mucosa, and the mucosa consists of transitional epithelium and the connective tissue underneath it called the lamina propria. So I mentioned that the ureter openings to the bladder are at the base of the bladder, the ureter opening, and that makes sense really, because rather than have urine drip down from the top, the bladder's going to fill with urine from the bottom. So that's probably a smarter way to go. So it kind of fills up this way. And so most of the sensory receptors for how full the bladder is will be superior. So the ureter for a while travels freely, but then when it gets to the bladder, the posterior surface of the bladder, it starts traveling within the muscular wall of the bladder so that it can open up in the inferior portion. At the base of the bladder there's a region called the trigone or trigone, and it's an area that's really sensitive to expansion and filling, giving you a sense of urgency. However, it doesn't initiate a spinal reflex. So this is called the trigone right here, that triangle. The bladder has a capacity between 800 mils and 1,000 mils, and it's distensible. So you can tell that it's distensible by these pictures, by the folds of mucosa that we call rugae. The stomach has these rugae too, these curly cues. That's just kind of I don't know, pinching or folding up of the mucosal layer. That mucosal layer again is transitional epithelium, and the muscular layer, it also has the ability to stretch. So those two things, the rugae, the folds of mucosa, and, well, three things, and the transitional epithelium, which can stretch, and the muscular layer, which can stretch, gives the bladder a lot of distensibility, meaning it can fill a lot. When it's empty, it's kind of flat, it collapses. But once it's stretched to a certain degree, there are neural signals that leave the bladder and they're sent to the central nervous system. These are called afferent neural signals, and they'll first go to the spinal cord and then to the brain, indicating a need for the bladder to empty. So the process of emptying our bladder is known as micturition. It's the action of eliminating urine. And it involves a reflex component and then a voluntary component. So the reflex component is a spinal reflex that involves a sensory neuron and autonomic motor neurons, both parasympathetic and sympathetic. Parasympathetic would promote urination, sympathetic would inhibit urination. And then the voluntary motor component is going to originate in the brain. The purpose of this neural control is to coordinate the action of three muscles. One would be the muscle of the bladder wall, which we call the detrusor muscle. So the detrusor muscle is labeled right here. And it needs to coordinate contraction or relaxation of that, plus contraction or relaxation of this sphincter called the internal urethral sphincter, and another sphincter called the external urethral sphincter. Notice that the detrusor muscle and the internal urethral sphincter are both made up of smooth muscle, so the autonomic nervous system will control those. The external urethral sphincter, however, is made up of skeletal muscle tissue, and so that's controlled by the somatic nervous system, somatic motor neurons. So let's think about this a little bit. During bladder filling, which muscle should be relaxed and which should be contracted? So the bladder's filling up. Well, we want the detrusor muscle relaxed. We want the internal urethral sphincter contracted. And we want the external urethral sphincter contracted, because otherwise the urine would just, as it was being put into the bladder, it would just drip right out. So that's what happens during bladder filling. Now let's look at what happens when it's time to empty the bladder. During micturition, or urine elimination, voiding, which muscles need to be contracted and which need to be relaxed? Well, the detrusor muscle is the main muscle that contracts, and the internal urethral sphincter relaxes, as well as the external urethral sphincter has to relax. Otherwise, if they didn't relax, you'd just build up so much pressure by the detrusor muscle, I think it would be quite painful to urinate. So let's just review that the detrusor muscle is going to be controlled, contraction or relaxation, either one, by some kind of autonomic pathway, autonomic motor neuron. The internal urethral sphincter is also smooth muscle, so that will be controlled by the autonomic motor nervous system as well. But the external urethral sphincter will be controlled by a somatic motor neuron. So let's look at the neural control during filling and then during micturition. So now the bladder's filling, and we know we want that detrusor muscle to be nice and relaxed. The parasympathetic nervous system is when we urinate. So we don't want the parasympathetic nervous system activated right now. During filling, it's the sympathetic nervous system that plays the biggest role. And what it does is it actually inhibits the parasympathetic. Not that you have to know that level of detail, but it's the sympathetic nervous system that makes sure that muscle does not contract. And also, the sympathetic nervous system is responsible for keeping this internal urethral sphincter contracted. Then the external urethral sphincter gets a message from somatic motor neurons to stay contracted as well. This originates in the brain and is extremely undeveloped in children under 2 years of age, as many of you probably know. Lots of diapers, right? Okay, now what happens during micturition? During micturition, now the parasympathetic nervous system takes control. And the parasympathetic nervous system allows for the detrusor muscle to contract. So sympathetic is lifted. Parasympathetic excites the detrusor muscle. It inhibits this internal urethral sphincter, and the somatic motor neurons are inhibited, but that signal comes partly from the brain, but it also partly comes from the sensory neuron, which we're going to look at in a second. Okay, let's look at the neural innervation a little bit more so you know who's excitatory to whom and what it's going to cause. So we've got 3 muscles: the detrusor muscle, the internal sphincter, and the external sphincter. The sensory neuron in this diagram is shown as green, and that will fire an impulse towards the spinal cord and signal the parasympathetic, this is in a kind of a reflex, and signal the parasympathetic nervous system. I'm having trouble with my pen. The parasympathetic nervous system to excite the detrusor and inhibit the internal urethral sphincter. Now, the reason that the same type of neuron can have 2 different effects like this, one is excitation, one is inhibition, is because the muscles have different receptors for whatever neurotransmitter that is, and I can't remember. Okay, so that's the neural innervation to muscles, but the neural innervation to the external urethral sphincter is a somatic. Now, this diagram does not show this, but there in your textbook it states that the sensory neuron that's shown here actually does have some effect and acts upon the somatic motor neuron, probably to inhibit it. I don't know if that's really true or not, but that's what your textbook says, so that's what we'll go with. Okay, so here's the micturition reflex. This is what happens when we urinate. It's an involuntary thing at first and then voluntary later. So the stimulus is stretch of the bladder, and a sensory signal goes to the spinal cord. That's shown by the green neuron. That sensory signal stimulates the parasympathetic pathway that goes to the detrusor, and it goes to the internal urethral sphincter. So that's parasympathetic is traveling to two locations. I know I should be red, but as we know, it excites the detrusor and it inhibits the internal urethral sphincter. And as I just mentioned, it is also possible that this sensory neuron synapses on the somatic motor neuron, inhibiting it, and therefore the external urethral sphincter will also relax. So that's what happens with micturition. Now in children, they don't have control over this external urethral sphincter yet, so it's always relaxed. Now let's say that there's a sensory signal, the bladder's full, and it's sent to the spinal cord, but it is not a convenient time to urinate. In this situation, the sensory signal, which always happens, will travel up the spinal cord and go to the pons and to the cerebral cortex. All things will be assessed, and an appropriate message, a motor signal, will come downwards. Okay. To prevent urination, there's a motor neuron that, or I guess you could call it an interneuron at this point, but a neuron that inhibits the parasympathetic. So you can see this picture. Let me clear this first so that you can see it better. And I'm going to try to use the pen part. You can see this middle red line that's coming down, and that's going to inhibit that parasympathetic pathway. So you wouldn't get excitation of the detrusor, and you wouldn't get inhibition of the internal urethral sphincter. The other thing that happens is that a signal comes down and it excites sympathetic activity. So the sympathetic activity, the sympathetic motor, would be activated, and I haven't talked much about that yet, but a signal would come down and synapse on this sympathetic pathway. Here's a ganglion here, but the sympathetic pathway would be inhibitory to that detrusor. And it would probably be excitatory, of course, to the internal urethral sphincter. The last thing that voluntary control involves is, of course, a signal from the cerebrum coming down to the somatic motor neuron that leaves the brain, or leaves the spinal cord, to innervate the external urethral sphincter. So there it goes. The next slide has a video kind of showing you how micturition occurs, and I'll try to talk you through it, okay? It's a little bit different colored, but it should work fine. Okay, the bladder's filling. It's filling, it's filling, it's filling. Finally, the sensory receptor detects stimuli, and the sensory neuron sends an impulse to the spinal cord. The sensory neuron synapses with the parasympathetic nervous system. The sensory neuron also sends information up to the brain, which sends a motor signal down. So this bladder is full, and this person can actually take the time to go to the bathroom right now. So the brain sent down an inhibitory motor signal so that that external urethral sphincter would relax. It also did not inhibit the parasympathetic. So the parasympathetic was able to cause the detrusor muscle to contract. Okay, let's think about the autonomic nervous system and determine which branch excites or inhibits each muscle. So I'm just going to introduce the way I think of this first. So the sympathetic nervous system, is it active when we urinate or when we don't urinate? When we don't. So I'm going to write don't up there. At least I'm going to try. Oh, for heaven's sakes. And the parasympathetic nervous system is active when we do urinate. I don't know why this pen's so goofy. No. Yes. Okay. Sorry. All right, so if you're thinking about it that way, it makes it a lot easier. Now the detrusor muscle. Will the sympathetic nervous system inhibit or excite the detrusor? Inhibit. And will the sympathetic nervous system excite or inhibit the internal urethral sphincter? Excite. And the external urethral sphincter, will the sympathetic nervous system do anything to it? No, that's somatic. I can't. This pen used to be a lot better. I don't know what's going on. Okay, whatever. The parasympathetic nervous system, will it cause excitation or inhibition of the detrusor muscle? It will cause excitation. How about the internal urethral sphincter? Inhibition. So now you pretty much know everything you need to know about micturition. And so the next slide has those answers, just because I want to post the slides with the answers on them. Thank you very much. That's all for the urinary system. Yay! Unit 2 done.